Over 2 years ago, on October 7th, footage from the Middle East shocked the world. Palestinian militants from the terrorist organization HAMAS killed nearly 1,200 and took more than 250 Israelis hostage. This terrorist attack became the largest mass killing of Jews since the Holocaust and the largest act of Palestinian terrorism in history overall, and in general, one of the bloodiest terrorist attacks in history. In retaliation, the Israeli authorities launched a large-scale military operation against HAMAS militants entrenched in the Gaza Strip. And not just an operation, but a real war, unprecedented in scale since the Arab-Israeli wars of the 20th century. But despite the overwhelming superiority of the Israeli army in terms of organization, numbers, and technology, this conflict is still far from over. And moreover, it has actually become the trigger for a whole chain of other wars, which have already significantly changed the situation in the Middle East and Western Asia as a whole. Today, we will analyze the geopolitical shifts that have already taken place in the Middle Eastern region over the past 2 years. And since, as I mentioned, the war is not over yet, my assessments will be of an interim nature. We will look at a number of important issues that, at first glance, may not seem very noticeable, but that doesn't make them any less significant. Israel has still not managed to destroy HAMAS. What has the war with Iran led to? Why have many European countries suddenly come out in support of Palestine? And did Trump help Israel? What does the future hold for the Gaza Strip? Well, of course, we will pay attention to the agreements that were made in Sharm el-Sheikh. I'm Semyon from Mega Show Television. Once again, we're covering the Arab-Israeli conflict. The longest war continues. I'll start from a slightly different angle. After the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, many Ukrainian experts and analysts began to say that Ukraine is destined to repeat the fate of Israel, that Ukraine needs to become a second Israel. Otherwise, it's impossible to survive next to such an aggressive and treacherous neighbor. In the information space, Israel was constantly cited as the perfect example of a modern, high-tech, and at the same time democratic state, which is constantly at war, but is still extremely successful, wealthy, and even socially oriented. However, upon closer inspection, the claim that Israel is constantly living in a state of war is rather a common cliché. A cliché? Apparently, it was created by people who have a very superficial understanding of the specifics of the Middle Eastern conflict. In reality, Israel has indeed been living in a state of constant readiness for war for almost 80 years, even though the wars themselves are short-lived. Even the First Arab-Israeli War of 1948-1949, better known as the Israeli War of Independence, lasted just over a year. Moreover, a significant part of that time was spent in short-term ceasefires, which were established to allow both sides to rest, gather strength, and regroup. All the other wars lasted only a few days. The Six-Day War of 1967 has long become a classic example of military art, as it demonstrated the possibility of achieving strategic objectives with extremely limited resources and, most importantly, in the shortest possible time. It also became an example of effective military planning, a high level of training and professionalism among both the command and the rank and file of the Israel Defense Forces. The Yom Kippur War, which took place 6 years later, was less successful for Israel. However, it lasted only 20 days, and until recently was considered the last war in which Israel fought against states. All other armed conflicts were mainly anti-terrorist operations targeting the Palestine Liberation Organization, Hezbollah, Hamas, and other groups. They usually lasted a few weeks, at most a couple of months. Thus, throughout almost the entire history of Israel, the basic principle has been a short war but a long peace. A quick victory over the enemy guaranteed years, if not decades, of relative peace and opportunities for peaceful development. Israel usually used this period of stability effectively to strengthen its position, modernize and re-equip its armed forces, as well as to weaken its opponents by non-military means. An example of this is the elimination of Iranian nuclear physicist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in 2020. So it's already obvious that the current war is fundamentally different from all previous ones in the Middle East, primarily because of its duration. And as the outstanding Chinese strategist Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War 2,500 years ago, "If a war drags on, weapons dull and warriors' spirits fall, so prolonged conflict inevitably causes fatigue and lowers soldiers' motivation." Prolonged wars demand huge spending on armies, supplies, weapons, and transport, which weakens the economy and causes internal issues. There's nothing more to add here. Now let's apply this to Israel. Israel is a small country about the size of the Lviv region with few major resources, and its economy mainly relies on the service sector. NATO is actually the first to suffer from prolonged hostilities. Of course, behind Israel stands a powerful ally, the United States, whose intensive assistance so far allows many financial problems to be mitigated. But what America definitely can't compensate for are the human losses, which unfortunately keep growing every day. That's the nature of all prolonged wars. And this is the first tectonic shift that has already happened in the Middle East, and it only continues to get worse. Reputational losses. The second and more noticeable change is that over the past 2 years, Israel has suffered irreparable reputational losses, which have essentially fundamentally changed the attitude toward it among many of the world's leading countries. The fact is that since the declaration of the State of Israel, it has generally been treated in a friendly and even sympathetic manner in the West, especially in the United States. To a large extent, this attitude was explained by a sense of guilt felt by Western societies for the atrocities committed during the Holocaust. Not only the Germans, but also many other Europeans, including Norwegians, Danes, Dutch, Belgians, French, and Italians, were collaborators. Later, when Israel was achieving victory after victory, sympathy for it was based on the fact that it acted as a kind of outpost of Western civilization among the foreign Muslim world. And there was also the factor of the Cold War, when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics supported the Arabs, and its allies bet on Israel as the only effective counterbalance to Soviet influence in this region. However, the prolonged war in the Gaza Strip has radically changed public opinion in the West, especially in Western Europe. In the first months after the October 7 terrorist attack, the overwhelming majority of Europeans and Americans sincerely supported Israel. The large number of Palestinian civilian casualties, at least 60,000 deaths according to recent international data, has sparked widespread global criticism of Israel. The situation is aggravated by the deliberate destruction of infrastructure in Gaza and the extremely severe humanitarian crisis. These protest sentiments are particularly evident among migrants from Islamic countries such as Syrians in Germany, Libyans in Italy, and Algerian Arabs in France. There have also been changes in attitudes among European youth, especially those who held left liberal and socialist ideas. There has been a shift in the main arguments from Israel's right to self-defense to preserving the lives of Gaza Strip residents. Against this backdrop, support for the Palestinians is rising, and Israel's actions are now openly condemned by governments, not just criticized. This is evident in mass protests, the rise of anti-Israeli sentiment, and even blatant anti-Semitism. And the peak of all these processes was the recognition of Palestine as an independent state in the United Kingdom, France, Canada, and Australia. Thus, the total number of United Nations member states recognizing Palestine has reached 157 out of 100. And although all these recognitions have absolutely no practical value, since Palestine does not have all the necessary attributes of statehood. However, these decisions were specifically made in order to spite Israel as much as possible. And as the cherry on top, the issuance by the International Criminal Court of an arrest warrant for the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the Gaza Strip. This decision is especially controversial given that a year earlier, a similar arrest warrant was issued for Vladimir Putin. It turns out that, in fact, an equal sign was placed between the Israeli leader and the Kremlin Führer. In the United States, which still remains Israel's most loyal ally, things are not so simple either. And although its support looks unwavering at the international level, and Israel continues to receive the latest American equipment, weapons, and ammunition as a priority, there has been a deep split within American society itself. Supporters of the Democratic Party, which traditionally upholds left liberal and globalist values, are increasingly criticizing Israel for its disproportionate response to Palestinian Arabs, calling for an immediate ceasefire and even for a suspension of military aid. In spring 1924, students on all university campuses protested Israel's military operation and supported the Palestinians. These events often escalated into mass riots and acts of vandalism. Moreover, the situation is aggravated by the fact that a significant number of Democratic Party voters are migrants and their descendants, including among the Muslim population, whose numbers are constantly growing. Naturally, these sentiments affect the position of the Arab elites. For example, among the entourage of former Vice President Kamala Harris, there were quite a few people who openly sympathized with Palestine and the Palestinians, such as Grinberg Cole, David Sitton, Julie Rodriguez, and Leila Elabet. Yes, of course. After pro-Israel Donald Trump took office, the situation stabilized somewhat, and pro-Palestinian protests were suppressed under anti-immigration policy. But the internal stance for the Republican president did not go away. And there is no doubt that the Palestinian factor will resurface in the next election battles, especially ahead of the midterm elections to Congress, which are scheduled for November next year. Ultimately, over the past 2 years of war in the Middle East, there has been a significant shift in public opinion in Western societies, which has already led to a substantial weakening of international support for Israel and even a certain degree of its diplomatic isolation. Everything flows, everything changes. Of course, European and American elites initially understood that Israel's retaliation operation in the Gaza Strip would inevitably lead to heavy civilian casualties. After all, there were quite objective factors for this, primarily the extremely high population density. About 2 million people lived on a stretch roughly 40 kilometers long and 9 kilometers wide. Therefore, in street fighting, it was impossible from the outset to avoid the deaths of many civilians. However, the calculation was for a quick and crushing victory by Israel, similar to previous wars, and as we know, the victors are not judged. But now let's look at why one of the strongest armies in the world has not been able to defeat a small group of militants for the 3rd year in a row. This will already be the 3rd change in the situation in the Middle East. The answer is that modern warfare is becoming increasingly difficult for the attacking side because of ever more advanced methods of defense. This is evident now, during the war in Ukraine, but it is even more obvious in the case of the war in the Gaza Strip. This is despite Israel's overwhelming superiority in air power, weaponry, and manpower, and its army being seen as invincible for the past half-century. Despite these factors, over the past 2 years, Prime Minister Netanyahu's goal to destroy Hamas and control the Gaza Strip remains unachieved. Despite the Gaza Strip being completely blockaded and militants lacking an air force, armored vehicles, or artillery, this still occurred. Nevertheless, Hamas, although it has suffered heavy losses, still continues to resist, using an extensive network of tunnels, drones, and mining. Of course, one might think that Israel is advancing so slowly in order to avoid heavy losses among its soldiers. They still happen, and Western mass media say they're now significant for the army. But even taking this factor into account, the fact that Israel has still not managed to capture Gaza is truly astonishing. This once again shows that any other ground war in the future will also quite possibly follow a similar scenario. Slowly treading in place, so to speak. Of course, if both sides are ready for a long struggle despite huge losses and missed opportunities. To begin with, it should be noted that for many years in the Middle East, the United States has pursued a policy of preventing the formation of an anti-Israeli coalition of Islamic countries. American diplomacy effectively played on the contradictions between them, for example, the religious confrontation between Iranian Shiites and the Sunni majority of the Islamic world. The imperial ambitions of Turkish President Erdogan were set against the interests of the Gulf monarchies. Plus, there were also contradictions among these same oil monarchies, often based on competition for energy markets, for example, between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. In this way, Israel's strategic security was ensured at the geopolitical level. The pinnacle of these cunning international games by Washington was the famous Abraham Accords, signed at the end of 2020. Their conclusion was, in fact, a triumph of Trump's diplomatic efforts during his first term, or more precisely, those of his then Secretary of State, Michael Pompeo. For example, Israel signed peace treaties and established diplomatic relations with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. This fact was an extremely important breakthrough on the path to overcoming Israel's diplomatic isolation in the Arab world, since before that, only two Muslim countries recognized Israel's independence, Jordan and Egypt. After coming to power, Biden continued this policy. Preparations began for the grand agreement of the century between Israel and the largest Arab state, Saudi Arabia. One of the key points of the settlement was the concept of two states for two peoples, which provided for the creation of an independent Palestine. Maybe not right now, but at least the plan didn't exactly excite the Israeli elites. However, at least they didn't openly oppose it, reasonably believing that exchanging their own security here and now for a rather abstract political form in the distant future wasn't worth it. Overall, it's a good deal. However, the HAMAS attack on October 7, 2023 completely buried these promising projects. In Israel, support for far-right parties calling for HAMAS' elimination rose sharply, while backing for coexistence between a Jewish and Arab state fell to a minimum. Netanyahu has repeatedly stated that Israel will never agree to the creation of a Palestinian state that includes the Gaza Strip, and also announced the goal of establishing direct military control over the Strip for an indefinite period. Essentially, this was a public rejection by Israel of the two-state concept, which undermined the foundation of previous United States diplomatic efforts in the Middle East. Naturally, the deaths of civilians in Gaza have further worsened the situation, and not only because Israel's actions have caused massive destruction and casualties among the civilian population. No less important was the fact that the powerful Israeli army has so far failed to effectively break the resistance of an enemy that is vastly inferior in numbers and technical capability. This has involuntarily raised quite reasonable questions among many in the Middle East about whether Israel is really as strong as everyone has always believed. In fact, this is the fourth significant change. 12 days that changed nothing. However, it's too early to write off Israel, and a recent example is the 12-day war with Iran, which is unique in many ways. For the first time since 1973, Israel fought not against terrorist organizations, but against a sovereign state, so this was a truly classic war. The United States directly intervened in the Middle East for the first time by launching missile and bomb strikes on key underground nuclear sites in Iran. Until now, the United States had never fought on Israel's side, providing only money, weapons, ammunition, equipment, and intelligence. For the first time, the main theater of military operations was not on land, but in the air, since Iran and Israel do not share a common border, so everything was decided by missile and drone attacks. Objectively speaking, Israel achieved a tactical victory as it gained obvious short-term military successes. First of all, significant damage was done to Iran's plans to develop nuclear weapons. The Iranian nuclear program was set back by months or even years. Additionally, many military facilities were destroyed, including missile and drone factories, assembly workshops, and key command centers. Furthermore, the Israeli multi-layered air defense system, with active support from American forces, demonstrated the highest level of effectiveness by intercepting the vast majority of ballistic missiles out of more than 501,000 drones. That's more than 90% launched by Iran. Meanwhile, Israel's losses are minimal, 28 killed, given the scale of the Iranian attack. However, this is where the paradox of this war lies. The strategic victory was actually won by Iran, and you heard that right. Yes, it was Iran, not Israel. After all, Israel's fundamental goal was not achieved, and that goal was nothing less than overthrowing the current political regime in Iran and replacing it with one more friendly toward Israel. Netanyahu and his associates openly admitted relying on public anger and unrest among the dissatisfied population against the Islamic dictatorship. However, this did not happen. The Ayatollah's regime demonstrated resilience and did not waver in the slightest. Numerous civilian casualties only united Iranian society, and those considered potentially dangerous by the authorities were immediately repressed. And after the end of hostilities, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, declared victory over the Zionists and the United States, which significantly boosted the regime's prestige in the Islamic world. As for the damage to Iran's nuclear program, it is significant but definitely not fatal. According to intelligence reports, the stockpiles of enriched uranium were partially preserved, and the very fact of Israel's attack only motivated Tehran to accelerate new nuclear developments. Apparently, it's only a matter of a few years before Iran returns to its pre-war level. Thus, Israel's victory may turn out to be a Pyrrhic one, since long-term geopolitical shifts are more likely to favor Iran. And if the level of unity and ability to adapt remain in the future, the day is not far off when there will be one more nuclear state in the world. That is definitely the worst nightmare for any Israeli. So what exactly was signed in Egypt? And finally, let's talk about what was signed on October 13th at the world-famous Egyptian resort of Sharm el-Sheikh. Or, to be more precise, let's ask the question, will Trump's peace plan actually work at all? At first glance, this gathering, organized at the initiative of the American president, looks very solid and reliable. In addition to the United States, 3 Muslim countries with significant influence in the region, Egypt, Turkey, and Qatar, acted as guarantors of the deal. By the way, the latter openly supports and sponsors Hamas. But here's the problem. At the final signing of the ceasefire agreement, the warring parties themselves were actually absent. Representatives of Hamas and Israel, although present at the negotiations, demonstratively refused to sign this agreement, which already says a lot, even though there was essentially no agreement. The Sharm el-Sheikh summit resulted in a declaration on peace in Gaza, but it was only a declaration, not an agreement. Just a declaration. It's nothing more than a statement of intentions about their plans, not about any specific commitments or deadlines for fulfilling them. So the paper signed in Egypt looks rather unserious, and the lack of direct commitments from the parties to the conflict makes this document extremely vulnerable to internal political changes and revisionism. Netanyahu's statement shows the Israel Defense Forces will stay in Gaza until Hamas is fully disarmed. Such statements clearly indicate that fundamental disagreements remain regarding the post-war fate of the Gaza Strip. This agreement, unless there are additional secret protocols, is focused solely on a ceasefire and the exchange of prisoners between Israel and Hamas. But it leaves aside the most difficult issue, the political future of the Gaza Strip and Palestinian statehood as a whole, without a clear plan for governing Gaza, rebuilding infrastructure, and most importantly, without international consensus on the legal status of Palestine. Any ceasefire will only be a temporary pause, especially since Hamas has retained its military strength, the militants are not disarmed, and their leaders publicly declare it a tactical pause, rather than an admission of defeat. The summit also showed ongoing deep regional contradictions. Netanyahu's refusal to attend, rumors about Turkish President Erdogan threatening to boycott the meeting if he was present, as well as the lack of any clarity regarding other regional players like Iran, Hezbollah, Yemeni Houthis, etc. They emphasize that the agreements of October 13 are only a local deal regarding Gaza, not a comprehensive peace pact for the entire Middle East. Security threats arising from the Iran-Israel confrontation, as well as instability in Lebanon and Syria, continue to significantly shape the regional landscape. In fact, this deal in Egypt became a personal public relations campaign for Donald Trump, aimed at positioning him as a peacemaker. If this ceasefire lasts at least a few years, then it can be said that the agreement acted as a kind of painkiller, temporarily relieving the acute symptoms of war in Gaza, but by no means curing the chronic disease of the Arab-Israeli conflict. After all, the entire previous history of the Middle East teaches us that a reliable and long-term peace is not just a signed document, but an endless process of political will and the search for mutual compromises. And until this will become dominant, the region is simply doomed to a series of lulls, inevitably followed by a new storm. Goodbye, everyone.